Hello, my name is Yadong. I am an assistant professor of communication studies at North Central College. I study health communication and intercultural communication. So today I'm gonna share some of my thoughts on this pandemic. I'm super excited to join this webinar and hopefully I can contribute to this conversation. For health communication, my research interest is about persuading people to do preventative behaviors in response to different health risks. And for intercultural communication, my research really sits in the intersection of identity and culture. For this pandemic, when I was researching on it, I couldn't help but realize that the United States is suffering from it for so long. And one of the reasons, at least partially, is that many people are actually resisting to adopt any prevention. If you look at the people here right now, many of them are still refusing to wear official masks when they're in the public, and many of them choose to go out and protest against quarantine or lockdown. So I think partially that's the reason why the infected number has gone up in the past few weeks here in the United States. But if you look at many Asian countries, especially East Asia, they have controlled this pandemic much faster. If you look at Japan or South Korea or even China, the number of the infected people has gone down in the past few weeks. So I think partially it's because the population in Asian countries are much more accepting this prevention. So they didn't really have a really hard time adjusting their lifestyle. They're okay with wearing official masks when the government wants to lock down the business or do quarantine stuff. They typically didn't really resist that much. So I think if we want to put an end to this pandemic here in the United States, we better move and persuade people to do prevention much more than what we're having right now at this moment. So I think this presentation, I want to talk about the cultural reasons for this different ways of reacting to this pandemic. So in the United States, we have our American culture. If you look at East Asian countries, they have Asian culture. So I study intercultural communication, and any health behavior, prevention included, is a result of your cultural beliefs. So we're going to talk about today about these two sets of different culture, American culture and Asian cultures, and see how these cultures influence people's reaction to this pandemic differently. The reason why I'm doing this presentation is because I want to encourage people to do prevention much more effectively. So if we know the culture better, we will know the population culture, then we will know how to convince people to do prevention better. So hopefully this will be inspirational, and hopefully we'll get a better understanding of what is going on right now. So there are four parts that this presentation will cover. First of all, I want to kind of just introduce the current difference of prevention adoption among these two areas. One is North America, and one is East Asia. So specifically, we can look at China and America. So first section here, let's contextualize ourselves with our topic. Apparently, there is a major difference in terms of how people from different cultural backgrounds react to this pandemic. On one hand, we have people here from North America, and we're particularly looking at American people. They have their own ways of coping with this pandemic. On the other hand, we have people from other parts of this world, and we're looking at East Asian population. We're looking at Japanese, South Korean, and Chinese here. If you look at the chart I have here, this is the poll done by GoUp. It's a website that gives health-related statistics, and you can see that only about 1/3 of American population have always to wear official mask when they're out in the public. That is a little bit surprising to me. If you look at other countries, we're looking at Asian population. They have a fairly high adoption of prevention, especially wearing official mask in public. So there are different reports about how wearing facial mask is very prevalent in China, in South Korea, or in Japan. Very unfortunately, I couldn't find any direct data to support that, but I have tons of friends and family members back in China, and based on our communication, since late January, everybody would have been wearing a facial mask ever since. So that's my experience with China, and there are different reports talking about people in Japan or South Korea and how they have adapted so quickly and normalized wearing facial mask. I do like this report. This is a CNN reporter called David Cover. So he lived in Beijing when the pandemic happened, and his experience was that in Beijing people move very fast, and wearing facial mask has been normalized very, very quickly, and he was really surprised that in the United States people are still resisting to do so. So I think partially because of people's different ways of responding to this pandemic, we can see two different results here. So on the left you can see that is the figure representing the infected people in the United States, and you can see after March, the number of infected people has gone up so fast and continuously going up. In the past few weeks, we have really, really high number of newly infected people, and that's very sad. And on the right side, you can say that this is the figure representing the number of cases in Japan. And you can see after April, the curve has been flattened, and that's what I've been talking about, flattening the curve. That is what they have done. They have very, very few newly infected cases, and the total number of infected people has been stable. So you can say there's two results here in comparison of America and Japan, and I think at least partially it's because the resistance to wearing facial mask in the United States that contributes to the increasing number of infected people, and that is something really sad to me, and that's the reason why I want to talk about the cultural roots of resistance to prevention here in the United States. So I did some quick Google search, and you can say there are a lot of reports talking about how and why American people are so resistant to wearing a facial mask. A lot of times people are talking about their autonomy. People are talking about that this is a political issue, and there is a political agenda behind this whole thing. And I particularly like the lady on the right low corner of this slide, and her sign says "My body, my choice," and that makes sense to a lot of people here. It's about your freedom, but we're talking about a pandemic that influenced everybody here. So it's not that simple. It's not only about you, but it makes sense that a lot of people are focusing on themselves because that's the individualistic culture we're having here. So I want to talk about the cultural reasons for this kind of resistance. I want to talk about some cultural implications of this kind of individualism, and I want my presentation to be informative. So next time you say people resisting wearing facial mask or resisting quarantine or lockdown, you can understand that that's partially because of the culture we're in. So you can do something to change the culture. By focusing on the cultural reasons, I'm not trying to say that culture is the only thing that matters. Apparently, one's choice to wear a facial mask or not depends on many things. Maybe it's depending on your political affiliation. There is more study coming out showing that for American people, their political affiliation actually influences their wearing facial mask or not. There are other demographic factors in there, such as your age, your gender, which neighborhood you live in, and whether you have access to wearing facial mask, right? So there are many, many reasons for people's behavior, but here we're only focusing on cultural reason. Partially it's because it's very important, and also that's what I study. So hopefully we're gonna have a better understanding of American culture and say clearly the association between American culture and the current resistance to adopting any prevention here. So we're talking about culture here. Culture can be a very fuzzy concept to define or delineate. You can have some culture that is so big, so grand. For example, you can have American culture or European culture. And sometimes you have very small, particular in a specific cultures. For example, you can have your family culture, or if you live in a community where people are very close to each other, you can have your own community culture. So culture essentially is an umbrella concept. It includes a population's values, beliefs, behaviors, and norms. So as long as there's a population, and this population, within this population, people keep communicating with each other, exchanging materials with each other, or sharing things with each other, they will and they will necessarily can form their own culture. So the reason why we are looking at culture here is because we want to say how culture influences people's health behaviors. Culture influences not only your health behaviors, but also your beliefs and your values about health. So when we're talking about cultural differences, there are so many things we're looking at: people's eating habit, or people's preference for music, stuff like that. So essentially, Hofstede, who is an American scholar, came up with this theory called cultural dimensions theory. He decided to estimate cultural differences on 6 dimensions, and the 6 dimensions will tell you how one culture differs from another culture. And this is very useful right now. Even by so far, a lot of scholars still carry on using this model or this theory. So we're gonna unpack the 6 dimensions one by one and talking about how they are going to influence people's health behavior. And specifically, we're comparing America and China in terms of the 6 dimension. For example, we're gonna talking about America is very low in accepting power distance, and for China they have a high power distance. So we're gonna move from dimension 1 to dimension 6 so as to understand the difference, the cultural difference between China and the United States, and see how this cultural difference influence their different responses to this pandemic. And after learning about the 6 dimensions, you are going to have a much better understanding of your own culture. You will always have a tool. You will also have a tool to make sense of a new culture. You will also understand why there's so many people resisting wearing facial masks in this country, because that is written in the culture. This is in our cultural gene. So we're going to start from understanding how these 2 cultures differ on the 6 dimensions. So in this chart, you can say that there are 4 countries being represented here. We have Brazil, we have China, we have Germany, and we have the United States. And these 4 countries are believed to represent 4 continents here: Asia, South and North America, and Europe. And we are looking at China and the United States specifically. So in terms of power distance, China has really high power distance, which means people are okay with power distance. So they are more accepting of hierarchy. So if there is one figure or one organization that is highly powerful, people will be okay with that. So they won't feel very uncomfortable to accept that there is a power distance between people or among people. On the other hand, if we look at the United States, it's really low on power distance, which means people like to think that everybody's equal. This is really the idea of democracy. Then you see individualism and collectivism, and this is a huge difference here. So China is really low on individualism, which means it's really high on collectivism. On the other hand, America is one of the most individualistic country in the world, which means people believe that you should prioritize yourself over the collective. And we're going to talking about individualism and collectivism more specifically and more in depth in a minute. So we're going to skip that right now. In terms of masculinity, these 2 countries are basically similar, so we're going to skip that too. Then you have uncertainty avoidance. So here, there's a major difference too. Chinese people are very, very not comfortable with risks. So that means when they are exposed to a risk, they want to control it. They want to manage that. And hopefully, if they can, they're going to try to eliminate that risk. On the other hand, you have the United States. American people typically are okay with some levels of risks. So they will learn to live with risk instead of trying to eliminate that. And people like to be more adventurous. They're happy to take some kinds of risk to gain more, and that makes sense in this. That makes sense in this cultural context. Then you have another one major dimension here. It's about this long-term or short-term orientation. For Chinese people, we're typically more long-term oriented, which means whatever decision we're making, we want to anticipate and predict the long-term effects. We want to know if we do this, what's going to happen in the future. And we all try our best to deliberate on this kind of information and try to make the best and the most solid decision. But for the United States, American people in general are not really focusing on long-term orientation. Instead, they really pay attention to the current. They want a short-term investment, and they want the short-term outcome. So everything comes fast and goes fast. So they're really focused on the current instead of the long term. And then the very last dimension here, we have indulgence here, or restraint. For indulgence, it means that people like to focus on their personal satisfaction. So I am doing everything I can to make sure that I feel good about myself. I want to chase for pleasure. I want to feel good about myself and about the world. So you can see American people score really high on this dimension, which means people really like to chase for fun, right? Fun is a very important thing here. And we say have fun all the time because fun matters. But in China, it's a different story. We like to restrain, which means instead of chasing for or longing for personal pleasure, we like to restrict our behaviors. We like to think about the consequences of our behavior and really try to scrutinize that. So we move a little bit slowly and we're trying to avoid making any mistakes. So that's the difference here. So instead of believing in pleasure, we try to think about what is the consequence of doing this? Is it really going to benefit myself and the collective others? And if not, then I'm definitely going to stop myself from doing that. So that's another major difference here. So typically, if you look at the 6 dimensions, it all makes sense. I mean, maybe you're not really familiar with Chinese culture, but as a Chinese myself, living in China and living in the United States for so many years, this 6 dimensions actually makes a lot of sense to me. So when I look at these comparisons, the difference between China and the United States, it really is consistent with my living experience here. So next, we're going to look at how the 6 dimensions and the difference, American and Chinese difference on the 6 dimensions influence their ways of responding to this pandemic. All right, the first dimension we're looking at here is power distance. A culture can be either high or low on power distance. If it is a culture that is pretty high on power distance, it means that this culture would educate its people to accept authority and embrace hierarchy. So in this kind of cultures, there typically are powerful figures and powerful organizations. For example, in China, we have a very powerful government that has a strong hold on many social issues. On the other hand, if it's a culture that is really low on power distance, it means that people are educated to practice egalitarian, and they're going to question authority, and they're not comfortable with very powerful figures or very powerful organizations. So here in the United States, we are very low on power distance. We practice democracy, and we tend to believe that everybody is equal. So if one person becomes too powerful or one organization becomes too powerful, the people would try to question that and try to even resist to their influence. A lot of people would say government's requirements, such as requiring to wear a facial mask or requiring to practice social distancing, a lot of people would feel uncomfortable with that, and they would say that as a practice of power and oppression. So they would often question, resist to, and even protest against such kind of government regulations. So you say the picture I showed a little bit earlier about some protest, and they say asking people or requiring people to wear a facial mask is just a new symbols of tyranny. So people are very not okay with that. If we look at the second dimension here, we have risk avoidance. So this is very easy to understand. It's typically talking about whether the culture educates people to accept certain types of risks. So if a culture is very high risk avoidance, typically people like to avoid any kind of risk. They would try to manage, control, or if they can, they would even try to eliminate the risk totally. But if a culture is very low on risk avoidance, people are generally comfortable with some kind of risk. So they will learn to live with kind of the risk and take chances and take odds. For Chinese people, they're very high on risk avoidance, which means they're very low on risk taking. They would try their best to avoid any risk. And we're talking about a pandemic here that exerts a certain health risks to everybody here, and Chinese government moved actually very quickly. They immediately did lockdown and quarantine, and there are some extreme ways to control this pandemic. And individuals follow this order just okay, because the people also want to control this risk. They don't want this risk to negatively impact their life. And on the other hand, we have American people here, and American people typically are more adventurous, and you maybe we are more okay with accepting some levels of risk. So we're more likely to tolerate this risk and maybe even have some this optimistic attitude towards it. Like, I'm not going to get it. If it's going to happen, it's going to happen to others, not me, right? So you see people saying things like, if it is me, then I will just take it, because they're okay with this kind of risk. They don't want to really try hard to eliminate it. And sometimes people would say, we choose not to live in fear because they believe it's just a small chance. The chance of getting this risk is very low. The chance that I'm going to get killed by it is also very low. So I'm going to live with that risk, and I'm going to choose to tolerate that. So you say there's two types of difference, two types of attitude towards this risk here. Moving on, we have a third dimension. It's about long-term or short-term oriented. For Chinese people, they're very long-term oriented, which means they want to focus on the future. Whatever they're trying to do, any decision they're making, they're trying to scrutinize their decision. They're trying to gather and analyze any information they have so as to predict a better result. In terms of this pandemic, they locked down immediately so as to make sure that the Chinese economy or the society will recover faster than later, right? So they're trying to sacrifice the current for a better future. So right now we're locked down. I think China experienced complete quarantine for a good 1 month, and that's almost unimaginable here. That's going to be considered a serious violation of human rights. But Chinese people are okay with that because we know we're going to sacrifice right now, so we're going to have a better future. And if you look at China right now, most parts of China are back to normal, and the pandemic has been controlled. But here in the United States is more short-term oriented, so the American like to focus on the current, like leave the moment, right? So they want to focus on the immediate effects. So I think right after several weeks of lockdown, many people are very mad with at the government, and they want to reopen business because they want to focus on this current effect. They want their job back, they want their business or money back, and they really emphasize on this immediate effect of lockdown or quarantine. At the next dimension here, we have restraint or indulgence. So this is also very easy to understand. It's about what people prioritize. For Chinese people, typically we like to restrain or confine our behaviors so as not to bother others. So whatever we're making, we want to look at other people and make sure that we are a part of a greater collective. So we would work on social expectations and try to be part of the collective, and hopefully the community or the group of people will be in a harmonious status. So a lot of people don't want to be a burden to others. That's why when Chinese government wanted the people to wear facial masks, most people would just do that because it's normalized so quickly. Everybody would follow this order, and when it's become a norm, it's very difficult for Chinese people to resist. On the other hand, you have American people who prioritize individual satisfaction. So indulgence means that you're chasing for personal actualization. You want to have fun, you want to realize some kind of pleasure. So typically American people like to work on their good feelings. I mean, we say have fun all the time because fun is really important. So we prioritize fun and a good experience here. So when you are thinking about wearing a facial mask, right, they can get really mad very quickly because it's inconvenience. So when they are not directly influenced by this pandemic, or when they're not really infected, they like to think wearing a facial mask or getting quarantine is inconvenient. It's a barrier for a better experience or better feelings. So that's why they resisted this very hard. So essentially my point here is that our culture really influences, if not decides, our health related behavior. And looking at the difference between Chinese culture and American culture, you can almost anticipate that these two populations would react to this pandemic differently. So the most important dimension here from Hofstede's theory is individualism and collectivism. And this is also the major difference that American culture and Chinese culture manifest. And we're going to take a look at individualism first because it's more about American culture. So for individualism, Typically, there are four concepts that the culture really values. One is self-sufficiency, second is uniqueness, third is autonomy, and fourth is independency. So, for example, self-sufficiency, it means that you are responsible for you, not others. So you shouldn't be relying on others, and your health is your own responsibility. For uniqueness, it means that you don't have to follow social expectations. You are encouraged to be different, and it's okay to be different from others. And if you can show your uniqueness, you will also be appreciated and respected. And you also have autonomy, which means others shouldn't really tell me what to do. So this is really about my body, my choice, the sign we saw earlier. And the last we have independence, which means others shouldn't really depend on me for their well-being. So your health is your job, and I really don't want to be responsible for that. So these four things together collectively tells us how American would react to this pandemic. So typically, individualism culture would educate its people to prioritize their own need, resist shared responsibility, disobey social norms, and resist governmental regulations. Typically, this will result in people's resistance to facial mask use or quarantine, when the risk does not or has not directly influenced them. Next, let's take a look at collectivism, and we're looking at Chinese culture here. So for collective culture, it's more about shared responsibility. So when I was a little kid in China, I was educated to work with other people, prioritize the collective, make sure that you are conforming with the group norm and you are respecting and appreciating others. So a lot of social rules are expected upon you, and you're not supposed to violate them. And families and communities come first. To demonstrate that, like, my name is Yadong, and that's not the right order to say my name in Chinese. My real Chinese name is Yadong, and Ji is my family name. So in the United States, you say your first name first, then you say your family name to kind of show that you are you. Then you are a member of a family. So you prioritize your independence. But in Asian cultures, especially East Asian cultures, we say our family first, then our given name, to show that first of all, I'm a member of this family. Then I am a human being. My independence comes later, right? So you see this difference here. And also, we're encouraged to obey social norms. If you violate social norms, typically in an individualistic culture, you will receive less severe punishment. But in a collective culture, if you violate social norm, you're going to receive much more severe social punishment, such as exclusion or marginalization, right? So that's another implication there. And also, in terms of the relationship between people and the government, for a collective culture, we are educated to follow government's regulation because government represents the collective, right? So here, those are some traits of collective culture. And you can say, as a response to the pandemic, Chinese people accepted facial mask use, quarantine, and lockdown just okay. So I think in general, based on the data I have, and as far as I'm educated, I think collective countries in this pandemic have responded much more effectively. But at the same time, when we're looking at these collective cultures and their powerful governments, there are also concerns. For example, the government should bear criticism such as violation of human rights or authoritarianism and interventionism, which means governments are being too strong, too powerful, and they have such a strong hold on people, such a strong influence on people, and sometimes people cannot really resist that. So that's a violation of democracy, even though democracy is a pretty much predominantly a Western concept, but still it's something that we should be paying attention to and something we should value. So I think collective culture has some strength in terms of collective response to the pandemic, and they can get things done much quicker, but there are some negative influence there. And if you look at individualist countries, I think they are undertaking longer negative effects of this pandemic, and we are experiencing much more prolonged pressure on the hospital or medical system and longer negative effects on the economy system. You can say the unemployment will continue to be high, and that's just gonna be the status quo for a while, because again, the government or the people together are not really responding to this pandemic very, very effectively. So I think my point here is not to easily say which kind of culture is better, individualism or collectivism is better. In response to the pandemic, I personally think collectivism is more appropriate, or is more cost benefit friendly. But I do believe it is necessary to have different alternatives there. So there are different ways of responding to this pandemic, and we can learn from both sides. So kind of to talking about the implication here, there are some questions that I think we should consider, we should ask ourselves. And those questions can be really inspirational, and especially for our future. So for the individualism side, I personally feel like the US government can be a little bit more effective and sufficient in responding to this pandemic. I think the government should definitely intervene a little bit more than what it did before. I wanted to secure a collective safety in a smarter way, instead of just letting people die and letting people decide their own fate. We selected this government for a reason, and I think it's the government's responsibility to get things under control. So that's my question for the government. And for the people, I think a lot of time individualistic culture educates us to focus on ourselves, to prioritize ourselves, which is okay. But when we are faced with this global pandemic, this thing that would essentially influence every single person, I think we want to thinking about our shared responsibility as a citizen, as a member of community, thinking about those people who are not healthy as you are, those who are vulnerable, those who are having compromised immune system, those who are older or those who are younger. Even though they're not like us, but we are all members of this community, and it's only reasonable for us to protect them because they cannot protect themselves. So we can move as a collective, as a community, as a country, as a globe, right? So I think that's important to think about shared responsibility. And for collective culture, I have read a lot of articles, reports criticizing the Chinese government in terms of its strong measures, like its quarantine or its lockdown or its mandatory facial mask regulations are very, very strong. And I think a lot of times we are violating human rights in there. It's not the most democratic process to do, and I do believe a lot of people may want to question this kind of measures, but they don't know how, and they don't dare to speak up, and they don't feel comfortable enough to resist to this kind of government control or governmental regulations. And for the people, and I think a lot of times when you are easily influenced by social norms, you will necessarily lose part of your own independence. And independence and critical thinking is very important. If everybody thinks in the same way, that is pretty scary. That to kind of conclude this presentation, I think it's important to know that people's health choices in terms of this pandemic prevention is really influenced or even decided by their culture. So when we're trying to change their behavior, when we're trying to persuade them, we want to look at the cultural roots of this kind of behavior. B is that there are different cultural possibilities here. And it's kind of risky for us to just be obsessed with one and be so embedded that we don't want to look at other opportunities. In a globalization situation like this, we want to keep our eye open and try to learn from other cultures. Thank you so much for spending time with me. And if you have any questions, there is my email in the webinar website, and I'm very happy to talk more about culture and health with you. Thank you so much.